remember the exact moment it all fell apart. My name's Natalie, I'm 37, and honestly, I should have known better. I was sitting in the penthouse apartment my husband bought me, surrounded by marble and glass, and all I felt was nothing. The view stretched out forever, glittering city lights blinking like distant promises, but they didn't mean a damn thing to me. My hand tightened around the stem of my wine glass as I stared at the papers spread across the table. Thick, crisp pages that carried the weight of every choice I'd made, and one choice I couldn't take back. You don't wake up one day and decide to end a marriage just for money. At least, that's what I used to tell myself. It happens slowly, creeping into your thoughts like a whisper until it's all you can hear. I wanted to be free. I wanted control over my life, my choices, and yes, my bank account. I was tired of being the woman whose designer dresses were picked out by someone else, whose vacations were booked without asking her opinion, whose very existence seemed curated by a man who loved order more than passion. I remember the night I said the one thing I shouldn't have. It was at a dinner party, one of those lavish affairs filled with people who drank expensive wine but didn't actually taste it. I wore a dress that hugged my body in all the right places, a dress he had bought me, of course. The laughter and clinking glasses created a warm hum around the room, but inside I was ice. Someone asked me how long we'd been married, and before I could even think, I blurted out, long enough to know that love and money don't always mix. The laughter around the table faltered, but I didn't care. My husband's hand, which had been resting lightly on my thigh, stiffened. He didn't say a word, but the look he gave me was enough to send a chill down my spine. I should have apologized right then and there, but pride is a stubborn thing. Instead, I took another sip of wine and smiled as if I hadn't just planted a seed that would grow into a wildfire. Later that night, when the guests were gone and the apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the city below, he confronted me. What was that about? He asked, his voice low and measured. Just a joke, I said, brushing past him toward the bedroom. It didn't sound like a joke. I stopped and turned to face him. Maybe it's because there's some truth in it. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Is that what you think? I don't know what I think anymore, I admitted, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to stay composed. He nodded slowly, as if filing the conversation away for future analysis. Good to know, he said quietly before walking past me and into the living room. That was the beginning of the end, though I didn't realize it at the time. I thought I was finally speaking my truth, finally standing up for myself in a relationship that had long since stopped feeling like a partnership. But looking back, I wonder if I was just looking for a way out. The days that followed were filled with a tense silence that pressed down on me like a weight. He went to work as usual, his schedule meticulously planned down to the minute. I stayed home, wandering through rooms that felt both vast and suffocating. I told myself I was justified, that I deserved more than what I was getting. But there was a voice in the back of my mind, faint but persistent, asking if maybe, just maybe, I was the one who had stopped trying. I ignored it, of course. It was easier to blame him. After all, he was the one who had built this gilded cage around me. Wasn't he? One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of my closet, staring at rows of clothes I didn't even like. Dresses that were too tight, heels that made my feet ache, handbags that cost more than some people's rent. I pulled out a silk blouse and ran my fingers over the fabric, feeling a surge of anger I couldn't quite explain. Was this all I was? A well-dressed accessory to a man who barely looked at me anymore. The thought festered, growing darker with each passing day. And then, without fully understanding what I was doing, I made an appointment with a divorce attorney. Sitting in that sleek, modern office, I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. The attorney, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, laid out my options with clinical precision. I nodded along, barely hearing her words, my mind racing ahead to a future I hadn't yet imagined. Freedom. That's what I was chasing, wasn't it? But as I sat there, a gnawing doubt crept in. What if I was wrong? What if I was making a mistake I couldn't undo? I pushed the thought aside, clinging to the belief that this was the right thing to do, that I deserved more. But life has a way of humbling you when you least expect it, and I was about to learn that the hard way. The papers sat on the table between us, thick with legal jargon that might as well have been a foreign language. I stared at them, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. Across from me, my husband, no, soon-to-be ex-husband, looked as composed as ever. His tailored suit was immaculate, his posture straight, hands folded neatly in front of him. He had always been like that, calm, controlled, as though nothing could rattle him. It used to make me feel safe. Now it just made me feel small. The attorney droned on, her voice crisp and detached. Terms of division, assets, alimony, it all blended into a dull hum in my ears. I nodded when I was supposed to, signed where I was told, and tried to suppress the wave of nausea threatening to rise. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? I stole a glance at him, searching for something, anger, hurt, regret, but there was nothing. Just that unreadable expression I had grown to resent. He wasn't fighting me on any of it. No arguments, no pleas to work things out, just silent acquiescence. A bitter thought curled in my chest. Of course, he wasn't fighting. Why would he? He probably couldn't wait to be rid of me. As the meeting wrapped up, the attorney handed me a copy of the agreement. The weight of the document felt disproportionate, like it carried not just legal terms but the collapse of everything we had built together. I shoved it into my bag without looking at it. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice tight. He stood, buttoning his jacket with that same meticulous precision. "I'll have the rest of my things sent for," he said quietly. I nodded, unable to find words. And just like that, it was done. Years of marriage reduced to signatures on paper and a polite exchange of words. As I walked out of the office, the cold January air hit me like a slap. The city buzzed around me, people rushing past, oblivious to the personal disaster unfolding in my chest. I stood there for a moment, disoriented, before pulling my coat tighter and heading toward the car waiting at the curb. The driver opened the door and I slid into the back seat, my breath visible in the frigid air. The leather seats were warm, but I felt a chill that no heated car could touch. "Home?" the driver asked. Home, the word felt hollow. I almost told him to take me anywhere but instead I just nodded. The ride was silent except for the faint hum of the engine. I stared out the window, the city a blur of lights and shadows. My reflection in the glass looked ghostly, a woman I barely recognized. Back at the apartment, I kicked off my heels and sank onto the couch, the weight of the day pressing down on me. The place was eerily quiet, the absence of his presence palpable. I reached for the bottle of wine on the table, pouring myself a generous glass. The first sip burned its way down my throat, but I welcomed the distraction. As the alcohol settled into my veins, the doubt I had been pushing down all day clawed its way to the surface. What if I had made a mistake? I tried to shake off the thought. No, this was the right thing. It had to be. But the voice in my head wouldn't let up. You wanted freedom. Is this what freedom looks like? I took another sip, trying to drown the questions. The truth was, I had always thought divorcing him would be a clean break, a fresh start. But sitting there in that cavernous apartment, surrounded by all the trappings of a life I had once dreamed of, it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like loss. I thought back to the early days of our marriage when things had been different. We had been different. There was a time when he made me laugh until my sides hurt, when his touch made my skin tingle. But somewhere along the way, we had lost each other. Or maybe I had lost myself. I shook my head, refusing to go down that road. What was done was done. But as I sat there, swirling the wine in my glass, I couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that I had walked away from something I didn't fully understand. And there was no going back now. I woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and the sour taste of regret lingering on my tongue. The empty wine bottle on the coffee table gleamed under the pale morning light streaming through the windows. My head throbbed with each beat of my heart as I blinked against the brightness. The apartment, pristine and expensive, looked sterile and unfamiliar in the daylight. I rubbed my eyes, trying to push away the haze clouding my thoughts. The papers were still in my bag, folded neatly as if they weren't responsible for unraveling my entire life. My lawyer had said the final steps would take a few more weeks, but in my mind, the marriage had already ended the moment we walked out of that office yesterday. A sharp ache settled in my chest, one I couldn't quite name. Was it guilt? Relief? Anger? Maybe it was all of those things tangled together in a knot I didn't know how to untie. I stood up, wincing as my bare feet hit the cold marble floor. The silence in the apartment was oppressive. Even during the worst of our arguments, the space had never felt this empty. I used to think I wanted this. Peace, quiet, freedom. Now it just felt like absence. I wandered into the kitchen, filling a glass with water and sipping it slowly as I leaned against the counter. My eyes drifted to the calendar pinned to the wall, each day meticulously marked with events, meetings, and reminders. His handwriting, neat and precise, filled the little squares. I hadn't touched the calendar since he left. He always liked order. He said it helped him focus, kept him grounded. I used to roll my eyes at his obsession with schedules and planning, but now I found myself missing that structure. I shook my head, trying to shake off the thought. I wasn't going to romanticize him just because I was feeling lonely. Lonely. The word hit me harder than I expected. I reached for my phone, scrolling aimlessly through social media. Pictures of smiling couples, perfectly curated vacations, and friends celebrating milestones filled the screen. I paused on a photo of Jenna, my best friend from college, standing next to her husband on a tropical beach. Her caption read, 13 years and still my best friend. Love you, babe. I set the phone down with a sharp exhale. Comparison was a dangerous game, and I wasn't in the mood to play. Instead, I made my way to the closet, pulling out a pair of leggings and a sweatshirt. Maybe a run would clear my head. The air outside was biting, the kind of cold that stung your skin and filled your lungs with sharp clarity. I took off down the street, my feet pounding against the pavement. The city was already alive, people rushing past with purpose. I envied them, their sense of direction, their certainty. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself harder, desperate to outrun the thoughts chasing me. But no matter how fast I ran, they kept pace. Why did you do it? What were you trying to prove? What if you were wrong? I slowed to a walk, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The park stretched out ahead of me, its paths winding through bare trees. I found a bench and sank onto it, my legs trembling. A group of children played nearby, their laughter carrying through the crisp air. Parents stood off to the side, chatting and sipping coffee from steaming cups. I watched them, feeling like an outsider looking in on a world I no longer belonged to. We had talked about having kids once, back when things were still good. But there was always a reason to wait. His career, my uncertainty, the fear that bringing a child into our complicated dynamic would only make things worse. And then, without realizing it, the conversations just stopped. I rubbed my hands together, trying to ward off the cold. My breath formed little clouds in the air, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. I thought back to the early days of our relationship, back when everything felt new and exciting. He had swept me off my feet with his ambition and charm. I had never known stability growing up, and he offered me a life I never thought I could have. A life of comfort, security, and ease, but security had come at a cost. Somewhere along the way, I had become a passenger in my own life, coasting along without a clear direction. I blamed him for that, for the way he made all the decisions, for the way he seemed to know what was best for both of us. But now, sitting alone on that cold bench, I wondered if I had willingly handed over the reins. I stood up, my legs still shaky, and made my way back toward the apartment. The run hadn't cleared my head, but it had given me something else, a flicker of understanding, however faint. Back inside, I stripped off my sweaty clothes and stepped into the shower, letting the hot water scald my skin. I closed my eyes, the steam wrapping around me like a cocoon. I had always told myself that divorcing him was about reclaiming my freedom, but now I wasn't so sure. Had I left him because I wanted to, or because I was too afraid to confront the parts of myself that had gotten lost along the way? The water pounded against my back, washing away the sweat but not the questions. When I stepped out, the bathroom mirror was fogged up, my reflection barely visible. I wiped a hand across the glass, revealing my face, flushed, damp, and uncertain. I wrapped a towel around myself and sat on the edge of the tub, my heart heavy. Freedom wasn't supposed to feel like this, but maybe I hadn't been honest with myself about what freedom really meant. The days bled into each other, marked by the same hollow routines. Wake up in an empty bed. coffee in a kitchen that echoed with silence, scroll through emails I didn't care about, offers for events I didn't want to attend. The divorce papers sat untouched in my bag, waiting for my final review. I avoided them like a ticking time bomb, afraid that once I looked at them, it would make everything irrevocably real. I'd convinced myself this was what I wanted, but now I wasn't so sure. Freedom was supposed to feel exhilarating, wasn't it? Like taking a deep breath after being underwater for too long. But all I felt was untethered, like a balloon cut loose from its string, drifting aimlessly with no sense of direction. It didn't help that people were starting to notice. Jenna called one afternoon, her voice cheerful but edged with curiosity. "Hey, stranger, haven't seen you at any of the charity events lately. Everything okay?" I hesitated, forcing a smile she couldn't see. "Yeah, just taking some time for myself." "Good for you," she said, though there was a pause that lingered a bit too long. "You know, we should grab lunch soon, catch up." "Sure," I lied, knowing I had no intention of following through. I wasn't ready to face anyone yet, especially not people who would ask questions I didn't want to answer. Instead, I threw myself into distractions. I redecorated the living room, swapping out furniture and art pieces in a desperate attempt to make the space feel different. I told myself it was about reclaiming the apartment as my own, but deep down, I knew it was just another way to avoid sitting with the emptiness. One evening, as I was unpacking a new set of throw pillows, the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat. It had been weeks since anyone had come by. I opened the door to find a courier holding a sleek black envelope with my name embossed in silver lettering. "Sign here," he said, handing me a tablet. I scribbled my name, my stomach twisting with unease as I took the envelope. "Have a good night," he said before disappearing down the hall. I closed the door, the weight of the envelope heavy in my hands. There was no sender listed, no indication of who it was from. Curiosity and dread warred inside me as I broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of thick, expensive paper. It was an invitation. A charity gala hosted by none other than my soon-to-be ex-husband. My breath caught in my throat as I read the details. The event was scheduled for the following week at one of the city's most exclusive venues. Formal attire required, of course. I stared at the invitation, my mind racing. He hadn't reached out to me since the divorce proceedings started. No texts, no calls, nothing. And now this. Part of me wanted to toss the invitation in the trash and forget it ever existed. But another part, the stubborn, prideful part, refused to be erased from the narrative of his life so easily. I wasn't going to let him pretend I didn't exist. The night of the gala arrived faster than I expected. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the straps of my black silk gown. The dress hugged my body perfectly, the fabric shimmering under the soft light. My hair was swept up in an elegant twist, a few loose strands framing my face. I looked every inch the woman I had once been, the polished, put-together version of myself that fit seamlessly into his world. But tonight, there was a difference. Tonight, I wasn't there as his wife. I was there as myself. Or at least that's what I told myself as I stepped into the waiting car. The venue was breathtaking, all crystal chandeliers and gilded accents. The room buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. I took a deep breath, plastering a confident smile on my face as I made my way through the crowd. People turned to look, their eyes widening with surprise. Whispers followed me, but I ignored them, my heels clicking against the marble floor with deliberate precision. And then I saw him. He stood near the bar, a glass of whiskey in hand, talking to a group of men in tailored suits. His hair was neatly combed, his jaw clean-shaven. He looked exactly the same. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to keep walking, pretending not to notice him. "Natalie." A familiar voice called out. I turned to see Jenna approaching, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I can't believe you came," she said, pulling me into a hug. "Why wouldn't I asked, keeping my tone light. Jenna gave me a knowing look but didn't press the issue. "You look amazing," she said. "And everyone is definitely talking about it." "Let them talk," I said with a shrug, even as my pulse quickened. We chatted for a few minutes, but my attention kept drifting back to him. He hadn't noticed me, Or if he had, he was doing a damn good job of pretending otherwise. The sting of his indifference hit harder than I expected. Jenna was called away by someone else, leaving me alone by the edge of the dance floor. I watched as couples swirled gracefully to the music, their laughter blending with the melody. I felt out of place, a relic from a past life I was no longer sure I belonged to. And then he was there, standing just a few feet away. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the noise and chaos around us faded into the background. "Natalie," he said, his voice steady but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I lifted my chin, refusing to let him see the turmoil inside me. "Hello, Daniel." There was a beat of silence, heavy and charged. "You came," he said, his gaze never wavering from mine. Surprised. "Not really," he said quietly. "You never did like being left out." The jab was subtle, but I felt it nonetheless. "I suppose some things never change," I said, forcing a smile. "Apparently not," he agreed, his tone cool. Another silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken words. "Enjoy the gala," I said, turning on my heel before he could see the cracks forming in my carefully crafted facade. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if it was him or me. I made it through the rest of the night with the kind of grace that only comes from years of practice. Polite smiles, empty conversations, and champagne sipped with a steady hand. But inside, I was unraveling. Daniel had always had that effect on me. One glance, one carefully chosen word, and I was a mess of emotions I couldn't name. Even now, after everything, he still knew how to get under my skin without even trying. By the time I slipped out of the gala and into the back seat of the waiting car, my head was pounding. The city lights blurred past as I leaned my head against the window, my thoughts spinning. Why had I gone? To prove a point, to remind him and myself that I still belonged in that world. It didn't matter. Whatever satisfaction I had hoped to find had evaporated the moment our eyes met. Back at the apartment, I kicked off my heels and sank onto the couch, the events of the night weighing heavily on me. The dress clung to my skin, a reminder of the person I had pretended to be for a few hours. I wanted to peel it off, strip away the facade, and be left with whatever truth lay underneath. But the truth was messy, tangled up in resentment, regret, and something far more dangerous, doubt. I reached for the bottle of wine on the coffee table, pouring myself a generous glass. The first sip was bitter, but I welcomed the burn. My phone buzzed on the cushion beside me, the screen lighting up with a message from Jenna. "You were amazing tonight. Showed them all you're still a queen. Proud of you." I stared at the message, my chest tightening. Jenna meant well, but she didn't understand. None of them did. The divorce wasn't just about leaving Daniel. It was about leaving a version of myself I no longer recognized. The problem was I wasn't sure who I was without him. The phone buzzed again, this time with a name I hadn't seen in weeks. "Daniel, can we talk?" I blinked at the screen, my heart racing. Why now? What could he possibly have to say that hadn't already been said or left unsaid? I typed out a response, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. But no words felt right. Instead, I set the phone down, taking another sip of wine to steady myself. Minutes passed, then an hour. The message stayed unanswered, but it lingered in my mind, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. Eventually, I stood and made my way to the bedroom, stripping off the gown and letting it pool on the floor. The silk felt cold against my skin as I stepped over it, leaving it behind like a discarded memory. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. The city hummed outside, but inside, the silence was deafening. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept replaying the gala, the way Daniel had looked at me, calm, composed, and maddeningly unreadable. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were fragmented and restless. I woke to the pale light of dawn creeping through the curtains. The air was chilly, and the emptiness beside me felt sharper than usual. I reached for my phone out of habit, the screen glowing with a single notification, another message from Daniel. "Daniel, I'm not trying to make this harder for you, but there are things we need to say to each other." I stared at the message, my heart thudding in my chest. There was a time when I would have dropped everything to meet him, desperate for any chance to bridge the gap between us. But things were different now, weren't they? I had chosen this path, chosen to walk away, and yet I couldn't deny the part of me that wanted to hear what he had to say. With a deep breath, I typed out a response before I could overthink it. Me, fine. Where and when? The reply came almost instantly. Daniel, our spot. Noon, our spot. The words sent a jolt through me. It was the cafe where we used to go on lazy Sunday mornings back when life was simpler and love felt easy. I almost laughed at the irony. Noon came faster than I expected. I dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, keeping it casual but polished. My reflection in the mirror looked uncertain, but I squared my shoulders and forced a steadying breath. The cafe was just as I remembered. Quaint, with mismatched furniture and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. A pang of nostalgia hit me as I stepped inside, scanning the room until I spotted him. He was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee in front of him. For a moment, I hesitated, the weight of everything between us pressing down on me. But then he looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a mix of warmth and something else I couldn't quite place. I walked over, each step measured. "Hi," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Hi," he replied, standing briefly before gesturing for me to sit. I slid into the seat across from him, the air thick with unspoken words. He pushed one of the cups toward me. "Still take it black." "Yeah," I said, surprised he remembered. Silence stretched between us, filled only by the clatter of dishes and the murmur of other conversations. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted finally. "Neither was I said honestly. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I know this is awkward. But I needed to see you." "Why?" I asked, my voice sharp despite my best efforts. "We already said everything that needed to be said, didn't we?" "Maybe not everything," he said quietly. I took a sip of coffee, the bitterness grounding me. "So say it then." He looked down at his hands, tracing the rim of his cup. "I'm not here to fight or make this harder for you. I needed to tell you that I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, unexpected and disarming. "For what?" I asked, my throat tightening. "For not listening. For not seeing what you needed. I thought I was doing what was best for both of us, but I was wrong." I stared at him, the weight of his apology sinking in. "And what if it's too late?" I whispered. His eyes met mine, steady and unwavering. "Maybe it is, but I had to try." Emotion clawed at my throat, but I swallowed it down. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Daniel. I'm not asking you to," he said softly. "I just needed you to know." Silence settled over us again, but this time it felt different, less heavy, more open. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in weeks I felt like I could breathe. And maybe that was enough. The cafe hummed around us, the aroma of coffee and freshly baked pastries filling the air. The weight of Daniel's words lingered between us, heavy yet strangely freeing. His apology had caught me off guard, piercing through the defenses I had so carefully built. I wanted to stay angry, to cling to my resentment, because it was easier than admitting how lost I felt without him. But sitting across from him now, I couldn't help but feel the cracks forming in my resolve. I traced my finger along the rim of the coffee cup, searching for the right words. "You say you're sorry," I began slowly, "but do you really understand what you're apologizing for?" He exhaled sharply, his brow furrowing. "I think so. I know I wasn't always present. I made decisions without talking to you. I thought I was protecting us, but I guess I was just shutting you out." His admission stung, mostly because it was true. I had spent years feeling like a passenger in my own life, watching from the sidelines as he steered us in directions I hadn't chosen. But it wasn't just him, was it? I had let it happen. "And I let you," I said quietly, surprising even myself. "I let you take control because it was easier than fighting for what I wanted. And then I blamed you for it." He looked at me, something raw flickering in his eyes. "It wasn't all your fault, Natalie. I should have seen what it was doing to you, but I was too focused on keeping everything perfect." A bitter laugh escaped me. "Perfect? Is that what you thought we had?" He winced. "No, not really, but I wanted to believe we could get there if I just worked hard enough." The honesty in his voice disarmed me. This wasn't the polished, confident man I had known for years. This was someone stripped bare, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. I took a long sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest. "So why now?" I asked. "Why say all of this after everything's already fallen apart?" He hesitated, his fingers tapping restlessly against the table. "Because I miss you," he admitted finally. "And not just the version of us that was shiny and picture-perfect. I miss you, the real you." My breath caught in my throat. How many nights had I lain awake, wondering if he ever thought about me, if he ever regretted the way things had ended? And now here he was, saying the words I had longed to hear, but it didn't feel like enough. "You can't just say that and expect it to fix everything," I said, my voice trembling. "I walked away for a reason, Daniel. I needed to find myself again, and I'm not even sure I've done that yet." "I'm not asking for us to go back to the way things were," he said earnestly. "I just want to be honest with you now, even if it's too late. You deserve that." The sincerity in his voice was almost too much to bear. I looked away, blinking back the sting of tears. "Do you ever wonder," I asked softly, "what would have happened if we had just talked to each other sooner? If we had been honest instead of pretending everything was fine?" "All the time," he admitted. "But I can't change the past, Natalie. I can only tell you that I'm sorry for my part in it." I nodded, the weight of his words settling over me. Forgiveness wasn't a switch you could flip. It was a process, messy and uncertain, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to take that step. But maybe, just maybe, I could start with understanding. We sat in silence for a while, the tension between us easing into something softer, more tentative. "I don't know what happens next," I said finally, "but I guess that's okay." He smiled faintly. "Yeah, maybe it is." We finished our coffee without saying much else, but the air between us felt different, less charged, more open. When we stood to leave, he hesitated, his gaze lingering on me. "Take care of yourself, Natalie," he said quietly. "You too," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. He walked away, his figure blending into the bustling street outside. I watched him go, my heart heavy but lighter somehow. As I stepped outside, the crisp air hit my face, sharp and invigorating. The world felt a little clearer, a little less daunting. I didn't have all the answers, and maybe I never would. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward, not away from something, but toward whatever came next, and that was enough for now. The days that followed our conversation at the cafe were strange, like stepping out of a storm into unfamiliar calm. I hadn't expected Daniel's apology to change anything, and yet it had left me unsettled. There were no promises, no grand gestures, just words that lingered in my mind, tugging at emotions I wasn't ready to confront. I kept busy, trying to fill the emptiness with projects around the apartment. I repainted the walls, rearranged furniture, and even took up sketching again, a hobby I had abandoned years ago when life became more about appearances than joy. But no matter how many distractions I piled onto my days, thoughts of Daniel crept in when I least expected them. I wondered if he thought about our conversation too, if he felt the same weight of unfinished business pressing on his chest. One afternoon, as I sat on the floor surrounded by paint swatches, my phone buzzed with a text. "Daniel, there's something I forgot to give you." I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. What could he possibly have to give me now? Me? What is it? His reply came quickly. "Daniel, it's better if I just drop it off. I'll be at your place in an hour." I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Letting him back into my space felt dangerous, like inviting a storm back into a house I was still trying to rebuild. But curiosity got the better of me. Okay. An hour later, there was a knock at the door. I took a steadying breath before opening it. Daniel stood there, dressed casually in jeans and a gray sweater that brought out the flecks of silver in his hair. He held a small, neatly wrapped package in his hands. "Hey," he said, his voice warm but cautious. "Hey." I stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. He glanced around the apartment, taking in the changes. "Looks different," he remarked. "I've been redecorating," I said lightly. "Trying to make it feel more me," he nodded, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "It suits you." I crossed my arms, unsure of what to say. "So, what's this?" I asked, nodding toward the package. He held it out to me. "I found it while going through some old stuff. Thought you might want it back." I took the package, my fingers brushing against the smooth paper. There was a weight to it that hinted at something more than just a trinket. Curiosity prickled at me, but I hesitated. "Should I open it now?" "Up to you," he said, his tone neutral. I set the package on the coffee table and carefully unwrapped it. Beneath the paper was a leather-bound journal, worn at the edges but still intact. My breath caught in my throat. It was my journal, the one I had kept during the early years of our marriage. I had thought it was lost or thrown away during one of our moves. "I didn't even know you had this," I said softly, running my fingers over the cover. "You left it behind when we moved into the new house," he explained. "I kept it thinking you might ask for it someday, but you never did." I opened the journal, the pages filled with my handwriting, thoughts, dreams, frustrations, and moments of joy frozen in time. Flipping through it was like stepping into a time capsule of our life together. One entry caught my eye, dated just a few months after our wedding. "Sometimes I look at him and wonder how I got so lucky. He makes me feel seen, heard, and understood in a way no one else ever has. I just hope I can do the same for him." My throat tightened, the weight of those words heavy with irony. "I used to write in this all the time," I murmured, more to myself than to him. "I remember," he said quietly. "You were always scribbling something down." I closed the journal, my emotions swirling. "Why now?" I asked, looking up at him. "Why give this back to me now?" "Because I think you need it," he said simply. "And maybe it'll help you remember the good parts too." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his expression gentle. "I should go." He moved toward the door, but before he could leave, I spoke up. "Daniel," he turned, waiting. "I don't know if this changes anything," I admitted, my voice wavering. "But I appreciate it, and I'm glad we talked." "Me too," he said softly. And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. I stood there for a moment, the journal clutched to my chest. My heart felt heavy, but not in the same way it had before. There was a strange lightness, too, as though something had shifted. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had a piece of myself back. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward healing. It's been weeks since Daniel dropped off the journal. Weeks since I've let myself breathe in the quiet, unspoken space we had created between us. The apartment feels different now, warmer somehow. The colors on the walls are still the same, but there's a sense of clarity, of possibility that wasn't there before. I've been thinking about us. About what we were and what we became. The tension of the past seems so far away, but I know it's not gone. The weight of the divorce, the way I walked away, those things will always be with me, lingering in the background like an unfinished song. But now there's something else, a quiet peace. I haven't heard from Daniel since that day he gave me the journal. At first, I found myself checking my phone compulsively, waiting for a message, a call. But as the days passed, I began to accept the silence. I hadn't expected things to pick up where we left off, but I didn't know what I was expecting. Closure, maybe, or at least a sense that I wasn't alone in my confusion. I found myself spending more time at the park in the mornings, walking alone beneath the canopy of trees. The air is crisp, the ground soft beneath my boots, and there's something about the solitude that feels healing. On one of these walks, I ran into Jenna. She was sitting on a bench, sipping her coffee, and for a moment, I wondered if she had been waiting for me. "Hey," she called out, a smile spreading across her face when she saw me. "Hey," I replied, walking over to join her. She motioned for me to sit. "How have you been?" I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. The truth was complicated, tangled in ways I hadn't quite figured out. "Better," I said finally, shrugging. "Trying to find my footing, you know." Jenna studied me for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You look lighter," she said, a teasing note in her voice. "Almost like you've figured something out." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "I'm still working on it." She raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying it. "Come on, Nat, spill. Did you and Daniel have some big, dramatic reconciliation moment?" I blinked, caught off guard by her question. "What? No, nothing like that." Jenna leaned in, her voice dropping. "But you've been seeing him, haven't you?" I looked away, suddenly uncomfortable. The truth was, I hadn't seen Daniel since the day he gave me the journal, but it felt like I had been seeing him in 100 small ways, his face in the crowd, his words echoing in my mind. And every time I ran into him on the street or caught a glimpse of his car in the neighborhood, my heart did a little flip. "Not really," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. We talked once, that's it. Just once, Jenna pressed. After everything, you two have so much history. I figured there'd be more. I shook my head, feeling the weight of her expectations. It's complicated. Of course it is, she said, leaning back on the bench and sipping her coffee. It always is with you two. I frowned, looking down at my hands. I don't know what to do with all of it. The past, the divorce. It's like it's all still hanging over me and I can't figure out how to move on. Jenna studied me for a moment before speaking again. You know, Nat, you don't have to have it all figured out right away. Life doesn't work like that. It's messy and it's confusing and sometimes you just have to let it unfold. I looked up at her, surprised by her insight. You make it sound so easy. She laughed softly. Trust me, it's not, but I've learned to stop trying to control everything. Let things breathe. Let them be what they're going to be. That's all we can really do. I nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. It wasn't easy. Nothing about this was easy. But maybe I had been too focused on forcing things to work the way I thought they should. Maybe it was time to let go of the expectations and just let things be. Thanks, Jen, I said, feeling a bit lighter. I needed that. No problem, she said with a smile. Just don't get too stuck in your head, okay? I chuckled, feeling a wave of affection for her. I'll try. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I went back to my apartment, feeling strangely at peace. I didn't have all the answers, but I wasn't as lost as I had been before. There was still a part of me that wanted more clarity, more resolution, more of whatever had once been between Daniel and me. But for now, I was learning to be content with what I had. A few days later, my phone rang unexpectedly. I looked at the screen, my heart leaping in my chest when I saw the name. Daniel. I hesitated for a moment, then answered. Hello. Hey, it's me. Daniel's voice came through, soft and uncertain. I've been thinking a lot about everything we talked about, and I wanted to ask if you'd like to meet again, maybe talk some more. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions inside me. Sure, I said finally, surprised by the calmness of my own voice. When? How about tomorrow afternoon, same place? I agreed, and we hung up. The conversation was brief, but it left me with a sense of anticipation I couldn't ignore. The next day, I found myself back at the cafe, sitting at the same corner table we had occupied months ago. My fingers tapped nervously on the table, and I felt an unfamiliar tension in the air. Would this be different this time? Would we talk about everything, or would we remain silent again, stuck in that same endless loop? And then I saw him. He walked in, his familiar presence like a magnet pulling me toward him. When his eyes met mine, I felt a flicker of the connection we had once shared, as though time hadn't passed at all. He smiled softly, and I stood to greet him. Hi, I said, my voice steady but my heart racing. Hi, he replied, his tone warm. Thanks for meeting me. We sat down, the tension between us palpable but not uncomfortable. There was something different now, something deeper, like we both understood the weight of what had come before and what might lie ahead. I've been thinking a lot about us, Daniel began, his voice low. And I realized. I don't want to keep running from the past. We can't just pretend it didn't happen. I nodded, feeling the truth of his words in my chest. I agree, but that doesn't mean we can go back to what we were. We both have to change or it won't work. I know, he said quietly, but I think we can try, if we're both willing. I looked at him, the question hanging in the air between us. Could we try? Could we rebuild something from the ruins? Or was it too late? For a long moment, I didn't know what to say. But then, slowly, I realized something. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe all that mattered was that we were here now, talking, trying. Maybe we can, I said softly, my heart racing but hopeful. Maybe we can. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel so alone. The next few days passed in a haze. Our meeting at the cafe had been brief but meaningful. More than I had expected, less than I had hoped. Daniel and I didn't dive into the heavy conversation